The night was supposed to be quiet, just another evening in a small town. But for James Carter, a retired war veteran, it would become a fight for his dignity. Dressed in his old army jacket, he had just stepped out of a local store with a six-pack of beer, ready to head home. That's when Officer Daniels showed up, a cop with a short temper and a history of pushing his badge too far. Daniels didn't like James, and he didn't bother hiding it. Maybe it was the way James carried himself, with pride, with honor. Maybe it was something deeper, uglier. Whatever it was, the officer saw an opportunity. He stopped James under the dim glow of the streetlights, demanding to see his ID. But James had seen this before, how authority could twist the rules when it wanted to. Things escalated fast. Words turned into shouts, and suddenly, Daniels reached for one of the bottles in James's pack. What happened next would change everything. A desperate move. A terrible mistake. And as James stood firm, unshaken, the officer realized too late. He had just crossed a line he couldn't take back. James didn't flinch as the officer tightened his grip around the bottle. His years in the military had taught him how to face fear, how to stand his ground. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was his own neighborhood, the streets he had walked for years. And yet, here he was, being treated like an enemy. Daniel's eyes flickered with something dangerous. He wanted control, wanted James to cower. But James wasn't that kind of man. "Put it down," James said, his voice calm but firm. His words were not a plea, but a command, one that made Daniels hesitate for just a second. The street was empty except for a flickering neon sign from the liquor store behind them. The cool night air felt thick with tension. James knew how these situations could go. He had seen it too many times. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and things could spiral. But he also knew fear when he saw it, and despite Daniel's bravado, there was fear in his eyes. Daniel's hand trembled slightly, his grit on the bottle uncertain. Was he realizing his mistake? Or was he about to do something reckless? The moment stretched, heavy and unpredictable, as both men stood locked in a silent standoff. James could see the struggle in Daniel's face. The officer had started something he didn't know how to finish. His fingers clenched around the bottle, knuckles white, but he hadn't made a move. Maybe he thought breaking it would give him an upper hand. Maybe he thought James would react, give him an excuse. But James didn't move. He had faced worse. He knew that silence could be louder than shouting. A car rolled by slowly, headlights sweeping over them, but it didn't stop. Just another night in a town where people learned to look the other way. James could feel the weight of it all pressing down, the years of service, the sacrifices, and now this moment, where a man in uniform saw him as nothing more than a problem. Daniels shifted, his jaw tight, eyes darting around like he was checking to see if anyone was watching. He had something to prove, but the longer the standoff lasted, the more desperate he looked. He hadn't expected James to be calm. He had expected fear, obedience. But instead, he was the one shaking. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, making the empty street feel even more hollow. And then, for the first time, doubt flickered across Daniel's face. Not just fear of what James might do, but fear of what he had already done. Daniel's breathing grew heavier, the bottle still gripped in his hand. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken words. James didn't have to say anything. His presence alone was enough to make Daniels uneasy. And that's what scared him the most. The distant sound of footsteps echoed down the street. Someone was coming. Daniel's eyes darted toward the noise, his panic flashing for just a second. He had started this, but now he needed to end it on his terms. His fingers tightened around the neck of the bottle, his mind racing. If he backed down now, it would mean he lost control. And Daniels wasn't the kind of man to let that happen. James saw the shift in his expression, the kind of look that meant a man was about to make a mistake he couldn't take back. James had seen that look before in war, in moments where choices had to be made in a split second. He knew what was coming. The footsteps grew louder. A shadow stretched across the pavement. Someone was about to witness everything. Daniel's grip on the bottle twitched. The moment was on the edge of breaking, and then it happened. The bottle slipped from Daniel's fingers. For a second, it felt like time itself slowed as the glass tumbled toward the pavement. But just before it could shatter, a hand shot out from the shadows and caught it midair. A young man stepped forward, his face partially hidden by the glow of the streetlights. His hoodie was pulled up, but James recognized him instantly. Marcus, the son of an old friend, a kid who had grown up on these streets. His eyes flicked between the two men, his breath steady but his hands tense. He had seen enough to know something wasn't right. Daniels took a step back, startled. He hadn't expected an audience. His confidence wavered, but he masked it quickly, straightening his uniform as if that alone could restore his power. "This doesn't concern you, kid," he snapped, but his voice lacked its earlier force. Marcus didn't move. He just held the bottle up, tilting it slightly, as if weighing the weight of the moment itself. "Seems like it does," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "Seems like you were about to do something you shouldn't." James exhaled slowly. He knew what was happening now. The power dynamic had shifted. Daniels wasn't just facing one man anymore. He was being watched, his actions no longer hidden in the dark. And suddenly, his next move mattered more than ever. Daniel's hand twitched toward his belt, but he hesitated. He could feel the shift. He wasn't in control anymore. His badge, his uniform, none of it carried the weight it once did. Marcus stood firm, still holding the bottle, his expression unreadable. James didn't move either, his steady gaze locked on Daniel's, waiting to see what he would do next. For the first time that night, Daniels looked uncertain. His breath was shallow, his eyes darting between them, calculating his options. If he walked away now, he'd be seen as weak. But if he escalated things, there was no telling how it would end. His own fear was trapping him. The distant wail of sirens broke the silence. Someone had called for backup. Maybe it was a witness, maybe it was pure luck. But either way, Daniels was out of time. He exhaled sharply, then snatched the bottle from Marcus' hand and tossed it to the ground, letting it roll instead of breaking it. "You should watch yourself," he muttered, his voice low but unsteady. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his squad car. James and Marcus watched him go, the tension still thick in the air. But just before Daniels got in, he hesitated. He looked back, and for the briefest moment, his expression shifted. Not anger, not arrogance, but something almost like regret. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He got in the car, and the flashing lights disappeared into the night. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. That was close. James gave a small nod, but didn't take his eyes off the empty street. He knew the fight wasn't over. Not really. But tonight, at least, they had won a battle. And sometimes, that was enough. James stood there for a moment, watching the empty street where Daniels had disappeared. The night felt quieter now, but not lighter. Marcus shifted beside him, rolling the unbroken bottle between his fingers. "You think he's gonna come back around?" he asked. James let out a slow breath. Men like that don't forget, but they do think twice. Marcus nodded, understanding. The weight of what had just happened settled between them. They both knew this wasn't just about one night or one cop. It was about something bigger, something that had been happening for too long. But tonight, at least, they had stood their ground. The liquor store's neon sign flickered, casting a dull glow on the pavement. James finally turned to Marcus and patted his shoulder. "You did good, kid," he said. "Being a witness, that's power." Marcus smiled slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Guess I learned from the best." James chuckled, shaking his head as they started walking. The night air was still cool, but it felt different now. They weren't running, they weren't hiding. They were just two men heading home, knowing that some battles weren't won overnight, but standing tall was its own kind of victory.